All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the April Restoring Neighborhoods webinar. My name is Nathan Park. I'm a Policy and Research Associate here at the National Housing Conference, and we're really excited for today's presentation. Um, Today we have Kevin Erman Solberg, the Digital and Geospatial Director of Mapping Prejudice, presenting with us today. As will be discussed, Mapping Prejudice are using maps to show the legacy of racial covenants in Minneapolis. Mapping Prejudice's work has helped inform the city of their history of segregation as council members move forward with Minneapolis 2040. The recently passed an ambitious upzoning plan to boost density and increase affordability in the city, which is largely zoned for single family and is becoming more and more expensive to live in. Here's a brief agenda of our webinar today. So we're actually going to switch some things around, and we're going to have some updates from us, NHC, after our presentation. But we do have one quick update. So we really hope that all of those listening are able to join us and other housers for an exciting day of sessions on topics such as communicating on Black homeownership decline and more at our upcoming for Housing Communications event. Solutions will take place next week on Tuesday, April 16th at the National Press Club in DC. Spots are still available, so if you're interested in attending, you can learn more at www.nhc.org/solutions. We're going to have these updates after our presentation, but some quick information for questions and technical details. So a link to today's presentation and the slides will be emailed to everyone who registered for this webinar. In addition, we do want this to be as much of a discussion as possible, and so we would love that if you have questions for you to please submit them in the panel on your right. There's a little section that has questions on it, so please just enter them in, and after the presentation, we will have a set amount of time for questions with Kevin. Additionally, if you need any help with the actual GoToWebinar interface, please check out the site below for any support. And otherwise, we're looking forward to the presentation. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Kevin, and we are going to get to learn a little bit more about Mapping Prejudice.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. Just checking. Wanted to make sure the connection was good. So thank you for the introduction, Nathan. I'm excited to kind of speak to this audience and talk a little bit about the work that we're doing here in Minneapolis in relation to mapping racially restrictive housing covenants that exist in the 20th century and charting some of the longitudinal impacts that these historical practices have had on the racial geography of the city today. And kind of before I get started talking too much about the work that we're doing specifically with Mapping Prejudice, I think it's useful to start with a story. And it's not my story, it's the story of the Simpson family. And in 1909, W.H. Simpson and his wife Daisy, they purchased a property in the Prospect Park neighborhood of Minneapolis. And they would be the second Black family to move into that neighborhood. But before they could even begin construction on their new home, they were confronted by a white mob. It was over 100 members strong, and they confronted the family and told them in really no uncertain terms that their new neighbors, their new white neighbors, would take any means necessary to secure the Simpsons' removal. Now, this confrontation, which the Minneapolis Tribune referred to as a race war, it failed to terrorize the Simpsons into submission. The family did continue to live in the Prospect Park neighborhood. But this confrontation did mark a pretty profound turning point in the history of the city. And in the early 20th century, Minneapolis, like many American cities, was not a particularly segregated place. This map, which I built using a numeration district data from the individual census returns in 1910, shows a city that's actually fairly integrated with a pretty low dissimilarity index. In 1910, the neighborhood with the highest percentage of Black residents is near North Minneapolis, and it's only about 15% African American. We also have emerging black communities really sprinkled throughout the city. In the south end of town, down by the chain of lakes, so on the shores of Lake Harriet and Lake Nokomis, along the Mississippi River, which became the West River Parkway neighborhood later, and throughout northeast Minneapolis. By 1940, however, this picture looks radically different. In 1940, or by mid-century, Minneapolis has majority minority neighborhoods for the first time in the city's history. Those emerging black communities, like in the south part of town, are completely gone. Down by Lake Harriet, Lake Nokomis, it's monolithically white by 1940. In fact, by 1940, there is no census district east of the Mississippi River that contains multiple black families. And one of the unique particularities for Minneapolis is during this period, the period of the Great Migration, this influx of African Americans from the rural South into the urban North, doesn't really take place in Minneapolis at all. In 1910, about 1% of the city is African American. By 1940, it actually decreases slightly. It goes down to 0.92%. So you're talking about a pretty small number of people and a pretty consistent number of people as well. So this kind of reimagining of the landscape that you see between these two decades, this isn't the result of an influx of new migrants. Rather, this is the result of the displacing existing black families and concentrating them in these increasingly narrow and circumscribed sections of the city. And when the Simpsons, first moved into their house again in 1909, they really had no idea that the city was on the cusp of this massive racial reordering. But in the early 20th century, racism is starting to be deployed kind of in new discursive ways. It's really starting to inform how people view space. As geographers often refer to this as the racialization of space, and it's this idea, this relatively, again, new idea, that the quality of an area is dependent on the racial category of that area's occupants, right? Which isn't to say that racism, of course, didn't exist prior to the 20th century, but this kind of particular spatialization of racism, it's actually relatively new. And this resulted in an explosion of segregative measures that took place at the local, state, and federal level. And one of the, I would argue, the most powerful of the new policies, new tools that emerged from this new racist regime was the racial covenant. I think the best way to kind of introduce those is just to read a few. So I have here a few examples of racial covenants that we found in Minneapolis and the surrounding suburbs. This one reads, "No persons of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot." And this particular covenant, I should point out, this was recorded in 1946. So this was recorded after the Holocaust. This one reads, "Neither shall said property be transferred or leased to a colored person. The said premises shall not at any time be sold, conveyed, leased, or sublet, or occupied by any person or persons who are not full bloods of the so-called Caucasian or white race." So the language in these restrictions is explicitly racist, right? Like, they're not really making any bones about who is being targeted as an undesirable person and who is not. But racial covenants were also incredibly powerful legal tools. And this has to do with just the nature of recording a covenant in a warranty deed. Because these restrictions were embedded in warranty deeds themselves, these restrictions tracked with the land and not the individual owner. So kind of to give an example of what this means in practice, if in 1910 I buy a home and add a racial covenant to it, 10 years later I sell it to a white person, 10 years after that they sell it to a white person, 10 years after that they sell it to somebody who isn't white, that person has breached the terms of the covenant, and I can sue them for forcible reentry and reclaim the property, and the property would revert to me, the initial granting party. If at this point I was dead, my legal heirs or assigns would have the legal standing to file a similar claim. So these things were incredibly powerful tools that ensured not only will the initial purchaser be white, but all subsequent owners or purchasers would also have to be Caucasian. And it took multiple Supreme Court rulings, most notably Shelley v. Kramer in '48, combined with federal legislation, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, to finally make these things illegal. But while we know that covenants were A, explicitly racist, right, and B, incredibly powerful legal tools, we actually know remarkably little about their spatial dispersion. Nobody has ever mapped the entirety of racial covenants for any urban area in the United States. So these more precision questions of like, okay, which neighborhoods have covenants and which ones don't? What's the long-term effect of these covenants, right? Like how long were they in effect for? How do they connect with historic and contemporary demographic patterns? How do they connect with home ownership rates? We haven't really been able to get at a lot of that, simply because the data has never been compiled, at least until now. And this is the main goal of the Mapping Prejudice project. We're based at the Borchardt Map Library at the University of Minnesota. We're a collection of geographers, historians, librarians, and community activists who have kind of come together to try to tackle this question and build the first comprehensive map or spatial database of racial covenants, again, for any city in the country. And we are still a work in progress. We expect to be done mapping Hennepin County by the end of the year. We've already begun to make, I think, found some pretty significant things. So I think the best thing to do is just kind of show a map of what we've done so far. Well, that's a green screen. That's not what that map's supposed to look like. One moment. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. So this is a cumulative time-lapse map that's showing the spread of racial covenants over time. So if you look at the top right, it'll tell you the year along with a running count. So okay, each one of these blue dots denotes an individual parcel that was covered or that was restricted through one of these racial covenants. And as I should point out, while there's already a lot of blue on this map, a depressingly large amount of blue on this map, if anything, this is grossly underestimating the total amount of restricted land in the city and the surrounding suburbs. We've mapped around 20,000 so far, but we expect to find at least 10 to 15,000 more before our project is done. So this is really kind of an incomplete snapshot, but you can already start to see that certain neighborhoods and certain developments are just completely blanketed with these restrictions. We do know that the earliest covenant in Minneapolis was put into place in 1910, just a few months actually after the Simpsons moved into that neighborhood in Prospect Park. They were used throughout really the first half of the 20th century. Even after Shelley v. Kramer, we found covenants going as far as 1955 in Minneapolis. There was a state law that was passed in 1953 that made the practice illegal locally, although again, some people still continue to throw these restrictions on there. But for really the majority of the first half of the 20th century, this was kind of the de facto best practices for the city. At least that's what we're finding so far. So, although this map is currently incomplete, I want to talk a little bit about some of our preliminary findings. And one of the things that surprised us a little bit was that covenants have often been understood as this kind of neighborhood level organizing reaction against changing demographic patterns. Like this is how the story's been talked about a lot in places like Chicago, where white neighbors effectively organized to, quote unquote, protect their space from African American migrants who are moving into the urban area. But in Minneapolis, that's really not the case at all. We found very few instances of individual homeowners or even neighborhood associations filing covenants. Rather, the driving force behind these seem to be real estate developers. And this advertisement is just kind of an example of how this is being used. So this Delphian Heights edition, kind of right in the brochure they would send to people would mention that the beautiful, highly restricted residential sites that they're offering. So alluding to the covenant kind of right in the advertisement. This one's even more explicit. They actually printed the language of the racial covenant right in the newspaper ad. So this one restricts ownership against people of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, Semitic, or African blood or descent. So developers are really kind of using these covenants as promotional tools, as ways to sell property. In Minneapolis, again, like many cities, it's greatly expanding during this period, and this practice of covenanting was seen as a way to protect property values in these newly developed parts of the city. So covenants are being used as tools of displacement. This is what we see in parts of South Minneapolis, those black communities that I mentioned, which were gone by mid-century. Those areas did have covenants, but they're also being used in this more preventative way too. So not just about protecting existing white space or kind of hardening existing patterns of segregation, but rather that all new land, all newly developed urban space would be restricted to the use of white people. And I think this image right here actually shows what I'm talking about pretty well. So this is an aerial photograph of South Minneapolis. It was taken in 1938. And each one of these red polygons that you see overlaid, these are lots that were racially restricted prior to this photograph being taken. So you can see the covenants are actually going in before the roads are even extended to this part of town. They're going in long before any actual housing is built. They predate sewer lines. They predate other utility connections. Kind of the first thing developers are thinking about as the city expands and as the suburbs expand is how to limit that expansion to the use of white people. And covenants proved incredibly powerful tools, to accomplish that, to really kind of write whiteness into the landscape. And here's another advertisement, which again kind of shows a similar thing. So Lake Nokomis, this was that area where there was a small black community actually in the first half of the 20th century. They were subsequently displaced via racial covenants, and then the land is kind of presented as sort of this like untamed wilderness. I mean, I think this image really evokes kind of colonial imagery, and you see the white family on the balcony kind of pointing out to this newly developed subdivision, right? And of course this subdivision was covered in racial covenants. So covenants are kind of doing two things, right? They're acting as tools of displacement, but they're also acting as kind of these more like preventative structures to embed whiteness in expanding urban space. But the third thing that I would argue that racial covenants are doing is dramatically restricting the ability of people of color, specifically African Americans, to accumulate wealth through home ownership. So on the left, this is the Holk redlining map, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And on the right, this is a dot density map showing the location of African Americans in 1940. So this is the density map on the right is based on demographic data that's just a pretty much at the same time, that the same kind of stuff that Holk was using there, like 2 years apart or something like that. But you can see the location of African Americans tracks remarkably closely to the areas that were redlined. But the other part of this map is that the areas that were greenlined, the ones that were given the best HOLC ranking, were also the areas that had the highest number of racial covenants. So covenants are working in tandem with redlining to create really this nasty 1-2 punch, where during this period, if you're an African American, there are large sections of the city where you can't buy there because you can't get a loan, right? Like you can't get a federally underwritten mortgage. But other sections of the city, it's illegal for you to live there due to the existence of racial covenants. So either you can't get money to buy, or if you can get a loan, you can't legally occupy the property anyway. So when these two kind of tools are working together, there just really isn't that much space left over where people of color can A, legally purchase property, and B, secure any sort of financing. And in the cases where African Americans were able to surmount these obstacles, and they're pretty big obstacles, they were often met with white violence. This is what happened to the Lee family in 1938 when they purchased a home in South Minneapolis. A similar experience, although a more extreme version, of what happened to the Simpsons back in 1910. When the Lees moved in, within days, thousands and thousands of white neighbors surrounded the home. They vandalized the home. They shot out the windows. They killed the family's dog. It was violent enough that the family's daughter, Mary, she required a police escort just to safely get to kindergarten. And frankly, this mob, and it really was a lynch mob, the only reason they didn't kill the family is because Arthur Lee, the head of the household, he was actually a veteran from World War I, and he called his army buddies in, and they formed an armed perimeter around the house just to kind of keep the surging white mob at bay. And the police, looked on and didn't do anything. And unsurprisingly, this continued harassment was too much, and within 2 years, the Lees had left the neighborhood. So even when these more formalized structures of and a federal lending policy that's highly racialized, these developer practices which are embedding covenants in the landscape, even when those kind of more structural things kind of fail to protect white space, at least in Minneapolis, kind of local white residents were more than willing to kind of step into the gap and use violence to ensure that the city remained white in a way that they thought was appropriate. So, but what about today? And that's kind of a lot of historic context about how racism has been built in, I would argue, to the property system of the city. But where is Minneapolis today? And Minneapolis, I think, has somewhat of a national reputation as really being a fairly liberal and progressive place. There was an article in the Atlantic a few years ago ranking us as one of the best cities to live in. We're consistently ranked in the top for educational outcomes, relatively low housing costs. With one of the better park systems in the country. I mean, there's a lot of kind of sort of boosterism about the city. But we also have some of the highest racial disparities in the country, and we can take a look. I'll take a look at some of them. The home ownership gap in the city between African Americans and white folks is over 50%. Over 75% of white families own the home that they live in. Under 25% of African American families own the home that they live in, and that's actually ranked number one out of the 102 largest metropolitan areas in the country. The Educational Equality Index, which measures kind of differentiated outcomes between white and black students. Similar to our housing disparities, it's also one of the worst in the country. We're ranked at 97 out of 100. So despite the city's liberal reputation and despite the city's kind of overall, I would argue, high standard of living, the gap between the lived experience of African Americans in the city versus those of white folks it's stark. It's one of the worst that there is. Worst that there is in the country. And a lot of that has to do with, I would argue, the kind of demographic patterns that emerged from racial covenants. So one example of that, this is a map that shows where African Americans were living in 1940. It's that same census map I showed earlier, and I've overlaid subsequent freeway infrastructure projects on top of that demographic map. And as you can see, there's a very tight correlation to where freeways go and where historic black communities are in the city, right? So 94 and through 94 effectively wiped out the Near North neighborhood, which was the largest black community at the time. Same thing with 35W, where it crosses the river. Same thing with the Hiawatha corridor, which is the southwest, the road running to the southwest, and same thing along 35W south, right? So these concentrations, these demographic concentrations that I'm showing you, kind of as I talked about a little bit earlier, I mean, these were directly the result of racial covenants. The connections with property values and demographics are also still very explicit today. So here are two demographic maps using 2010 census data showing the percentage of white residents in the city. And the city on average, it's still majority white, but about 53%. And that's what the map on the left is showing you. The one on the right, however, is showing the demographics of areas that were historically racially covenanted. And the city average there, it's almost 80%, right? So you're talking about 26% difference. So even though the covenants themselves have been illegal now for over 50 years, covenanted areas are still far wider than the city is on average. I mean, there's a very real kind of temporal connection between these historic practices and contemporary demographic patterns. Another way to kind of slice this data and look at it is the performance of single-family homes in covenanted versus redlined areas. So the map on the left shows the valuation of single-family homes based on a 2018 tax assessment data. This is a slightly buffered map, so all these homes on the left, that means they're within a quarter mile of a historically covenanted home. And these covenanted areas are actually performing 15,000 over city median. And the city median right now in Minneapolis for single-family homes, it's about 220,000. The map on the right, on the other hand, shows the existence or not the existence of, but rather the valuation of homes that were in historically redlined neighborhoods, right? And as that map I showed earlier demonstrated, areas were redlined, at least in Minneapolis, the areas that were redlined almost always had a high percentage of African Americans. And these redlined areas are actually performing significantly under city median value, about $65,000. When you take these two things together, you're looking at a gap of over $80,000 in how property has accumulated based on whether it was a historically redlined or a historically covenanted area. But despite all of this, a new Pew poll came out a few months ago that showed that the majority of white Americans don't think structural racism is real. The majority of white Americans don't believe there is a significant racial wealth gap in this country. So despite the preponderance of evidence, creating and constructing kind of contemporary policy remedies has been remarkably challenging, in large part because the electorate doesn't necessarily believe that there really is a problem in the first place. And what Mapping Prejudice is trying to do as a project is not just kind of create these data sets, although I think that is important, and to kind of help set up empirically derived both a policy as well as a kind of spatial analysis. But part of what we're interested in doing with Mapping Prejudice is changing this broader conversation, changing this broader understanding of how race and racism is built into really the very structures of our urban environments today. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of how we're accomplishing this broader narrative shift. And this has to do with the methodology of our project. So I mentioned earlier that no city has ever built a comprehensive database of racial covenants in the United States. And the reason for that is that the only way to find a covenant is to read a warranty deed. And to put kind of the problem and scope for all of you, in Hennepin County, between 1900 and 1960, there were about 3 million warranty deeds recorded, and on average, each one runs about 3 pages. So you're looking at in the ballpark of 10 million documents. Obviously, this is an amount of paper that's just completely unwieldy, right? Like nobody can actually read through all of those records. So we've developed kind of this 3-step process to tackle this problem, and we use optical character recognition to identify deeds that likely contain racial covenants. Once we've identified the likely candidates, we upload those to a crowdsourcing platform called Zooniverse. And here, volunteers they go to our website, they click the Get Involved button, it takes them to Zooniverse, and it pulls up a deed the computer thinks contains racial language and asks the volunteer a few questions about that deed. So, who bought the property, who sold it, the other attributable information that we're interested in, and those results are then exported and mapped in ArcGIS. So OCR narrows it down. Zooniverse is what gets us the data in a form we can work with, and then ArcMap does the heavy spatial lifting. But we found through this Zooniverse kind of process, and by opening up our research methodology, getting folks to actually read these deeds has a profoundly transformative power in and of itself, right? And we've had countless volunteers reach out to us afterwards and say things like, by reading these deeds helped me understand racism in a way that I was never able to before. My favorite example of this is we actually do live transcription sessions where we invite a bunch of folks in. I give a presentation kind of similar to this one, and then at the end, everybody opens their laptop and starts transcribing some of these deeds on Zooniverse. And this one guy raises his hand and says, he just goes, "Wow, these are actually really, really racist." And it's kind of like, yeah, I know they are. Like I just spent the last 40 minutes explaining how these things are racist. But we found that having people kind of grapple with and engage with the actual primary source material, the actual documents that contain this language, that's really has remarkable transformative power. It has the power to kind of localize racism, make it feel more material and tangible in a way that kind of broader statistical discussions or broader structural discussions often can't do. And through this, so by opening up our methodology, inviting folks in, as well as publishing the maps and all the stuff I've shown you today, that's all available on our website. This really has resulted in, I would say, a pretty kind of remarkable shift in the kinds of conversations we're having locally about race and housing justice. And a few things have happened now within the last year to kind of demonstrate that. So as Nathan mentioned in the beginning, CPED, the central planning agency for the city, they're in the middle of this 2040 comprehensive plan, which is kind of the long-term development plan for the city. And they overlaid our covenants data with their contemporary zoning data and found a very, very close correlation between areas zoned as single family and areas that used to contain racial covenants. And using our data, they're actually kind of incorporating this into their subsequent recommendations to create more kind of equitably distributed density patterns in the city. We another state legislature member of the House of Representatives for the state for Minneapolis, he actually through this Universe process found the covenant for his house, and that was such a transformative moment for him. He actually introduced legislation. It's going to be voted on. It cleared the subcommittees and it's going to be voted on sometime in the next few weeks to allow contemporary homeowners to file addendums renouncing racial covenants that might exist on their property. And we've also cooperated with a whole host of local community organizations and housing advocacy groups to help kind of not legitimize, but add visibility to the work that's already going on. And when we talk to a lot of these organizations, especially organizations that deal primarily with communities of color, for them it's not so much that the policy solutions don't exist, but rather that nobody really takes them seriously, that nobody's really listening to them. And I think this connects to the point I made earlier, where it's really hard to get equity-minded policy solutions passed if the majority of the population doesn't believe there's a problem in the first place, right? So we found kind of this niche sort of in between where we're not necessarily advocating for, okay, this is the 10-point plan of housing justice and here's how you need to implement it and these are the specific policy recommendations, but rather we view our work in this more kind of facilitative role that, those conversations are kind of already happening. And what we can do with our work is help change these broader kind of popular understandings of the past, change this broader narrative, change understandings of how racism is embedded into the urban environment and how racism continues to influence these massive disparities between Black and white homeownership rates. So I know kind of for this audience, maybe you want a little bit more on like, here are the specific policy solutions. But that's not really what we do. Rather we're trying to use our work to kind of lend credence to those who are already engaging in those conversations. So if you want to learn more about our project, you can go to our website at mappingprejudice.org. There's instructions on there on how to get involved if you want to participate in some of the Zooniverse mapping, and that also has kind of some blog posts, some additional narrative work on what racial covenants mean in Minneapolis and what we found. And I would also like to point out too that as we wrap up Hennepin County now over the next few months, we are in preliminary talks with kind of replicating this work in other urban areas. We've been talking with our sister city, St. Paul, but also with folks in Milwaukee and St. Louis to try to do comparable stuff down there with mapping covenants. So I think that's kind of all I have for formal presentation, but I would love to hear kind of some of the questions that you folks might have for me. So maybe turn it back over to Nathan if you want to curate some of that.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Kevin. That was an awesome presentation, and we are really grateful for the incredible work that you all are doing at Mapping Prejudice. We do have our president, David Dworkin, is going to hop on the line real quick right before we head into Q&A, so I'm going to turn it over to David now.
Thanks.
Okay.
Can you hear me, Nathan? Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, great. I want to make sure my mic was working. So thank you, Kevin, very much, and thanks to everybody for being on this call. We're really interested in your questions. I just wanted to say that this is part of an ongoing process for us of taking a deep dive into this issue of Black home ownership. And as everybody knows, the numbers in terms of the Black home ownership rate are at historic lows. And what we found is that the experience of Black homeowners during the crisis is actually unique among other minority groups. And so when we look at the big picture of how to address this issue, and we're talking to people all over the country about this, and really encourage any of you who are not members who are interested in becoming a part of the work that we're doing on our Black homeownership working group to please consider joining and helping us with this. There are a couple issues. One is that there's clearly, as Kevin pointed out, an enormous awareness gap of the history of this, and I think this is an important predicate to the whole conversation, is understanding where we actually are coming from. But there's another component of this, which is the Black experience, and the challenge for lenders who are actually working towards building Black home ownership, to convincing customers that this time is going to be different. And I think part of what we're really going to try to assess is to what extent can we say that with credibility and defend it, to ensure that, in fact, it is going to be different, because in many families, it's not unusual to have a grandparent who had this very experience in any number of cities throughout the country, north or south, east or west. I know this happened throughout the Metro Detroit area where I grew up, and in fact, in my own family, we moved on one side of Lincoln Road because Jews weren't allowed north of Lincoln Road. And so these covenants are very much a part of our history, and they are, along with redlining, scars in the demographic maps that even when the red lines go away, the scars remain and the impact lasts. But their parents may also have had the experience of being in neighborhoods that were devastated by FHA lending in the 1970s and the foreclosure crisis that occurred in the early 1970s and mid-1970s. It was devastating in many neighborhoods throughout the country. And then themselves having the experience of either losing their homes during the mortgage crisis in the last about 10 years ago, or knowing friends who have. And so to be able to go and say, oh yes, we think you should take that risk and try to become a homeowner again, we've got a lot of work to do there. We need to understand the marketing better. We need to understand the market better. We need to make sure we have the right products, and we need to make sure that our policies and our statutory and regulatory support is there to make a difference. Otherwise, this trend is going to be difficult, if not impossible, to turn around. And I think it's really critical that we do that. So thank you, Kevin. And I guess I would just jump in with the first question and ask, based on what you've seen here, what do you, Kevin, what do you think are the next steps in terms of addressing these, long-standing issues, and what are you hearing about in Hennepin County about what the steps that have been taken so far have actually yielded in results, if any?
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that's a great question, and I also want to point out too. I had your insight on the kind of the lived experience of Black homeownership. Like, I haven't thought that much about that, and that's I don't know. You got my brain turning a little bit. This is one of the issues of being a geographer and a historian, right? Like, I'm always looking, always looking back. That's a good point. Yeah.
When I was at Fannie Mae, we actually did a lot of focus grouping of African American potential home buyers and existing home buyers to understand the experience they were having, and the fear of rejection and the sense of humiliation was a huge barrier to getting people to actually apply. And the role that evolved out of that was the mortgage broker, who may have had a place in their community, at a church, or in their neighborhood. And when the mortgage brokers were incented to use a lot of predatory equity stripping products, that trusted advisor turned into a nightmare scenario. And so now, looking forward, who plays that role, and how do we ensure that all the incentives are aligned to ensure that people get the right product?
Right. Yeah. No. How to convince folks that this time it will be different, and also how to ensure that this time it actually will be different. I mean, those are great questions. But in response to what you asked me, I mean, some of the things that we're hearing a lot around here, a new proposal just came out, and I don't know too much about the specifics. It originated in Detroit, but it's generated a lot of buzz here. which is trying to preserve existing minority homeownership through scaling back property taxes and scaling property tax assessments in line with annual income. And Detroit's done something along those lines, but it's more of like an opt-in type thing where if you fall below a certain threshold, your property taxes are essentially kind of dropped. But there's been a lot of talk on folks in neighborhoods that are experiencing, gentrification, especially people who have lived there for a really long time, where, their tax burden's just doubling or tripling, right, over the last 10 years. So how can you kind of stem the bleeding a little bit is one thing that a lot of folks have been talking about. There's been a lot of buzz on community land trust as kind of an alternative to kind of traditional home ownership here in the city, and that's made a lot of headways, or a lot of inroads in historically kind of underserved communities. I think that's something worth exploring more. And the biggest one, though, has to do, I would say, with just rent control and affordability, where it feels less like, and this is one of the reasons why I was so interested in that point that you made, because it does feel less like an interest in increasing home ownership right now, and rather more of this triage of like, we just want to make sure we don't get evicted in the next 6 months, right? Like, we just want to make sure we can still continue to live in this neighborhood in some capacity, and our rents aren't going to double or triple. And I'm wondering, if some of that is kind of rooted in what you're talking about, that, this really traumatic and intergenerationally traumatic experience of home ownership for people of color and for, kind of non-white folks more broadly. I'm wondering if that has something to do with kind of a lot of the impetus being on rental, controlling rental costs rather than increasing home ownership per se. But,
Great.
yeah.
All right. Well, with that, we can hop into more of the questions that people are asking in the chat as well. I just, at the top line, a few people have asked about, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we will be sharing the slides. But Kevin, maybe this just might be helpful for filing's sake. People are asking about, access to your presentation and how they might be able to cite you. So is that something that maybe afterwards we can, maybe give people your contact information, or how would you like to go forward with something?
Yeah, so I mean, in general, my contact info is on the website. If you go to mathprejudice.org, there's like a team page, and my information's on there. For citing our work, if it's a general thing, you can cite the project. If it's something more like a specific map or spatial statistic or something like that, my name followed by the project would probably be more appropriate. And if anyone's interested in the slide deck, I'm not hosting this specific PowerPoint anywhere, but I would be happy to distribute that through email. If anyone wants to, contact me for it.
Great. And then one more, just administrative question that someone just threw in. They're wondering if your source code files or GIS files and process data sets are available, or if there are methodology write-ups about the work that you all are doing at.
Yep. So all of our data will be public as soon as we're done mapping the county. Right now, we just have a bunch of kind of like intermediate data sets, and I don't want kind of bunch of incomplete stuff floating out there. Again, anybody who reaches out to me, like, I'm happy to send over like the shape files that we currently have, or kind of whatever part you're interested in. But all of both the derived kind of data as well as the raw data is going to be available through the Mapping Prejudice website once we're done mapping Hennepin County.
Perfect. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
So here's another question. Someone is asking, did your organization cooperate with the organizations working on Minneapolis's recent zoning changes? And how would you say your work contributed to that discussion?
Yeah, so CPED, who's kind of the driving municipal force behind that, they actually reached out to us pretty early on in our project, where I gave a presentation and someone from CPED was there, kind of saw the preliminary map, and that jogged in their heads like, wow, this actually says a lot about how kind of contemporary zoning policies. And I'm not a city planner, so I can't speak to kind of what regression model or whatever that they might have used to kind of come to these conclusions. But I do know that one of the arguments that they're using to kind of justify upzoning R1A single family neighborhoods in the city is through this equity prism, and specifically the relationship that single-family zoned neighborhoods have with the location of racial covenants. It is a pretty close correlation here, where redlined areas are almost all zoned as high density mixed use, and not every R1 neighborhood had covenants, but every neighborhood that had covenants is zoned as R1, would be probably the most accurate way to think about that.
Great. This next question has a bit of a build-up. Someone left more of a comment, but I think that the two work together well. So this person said, structural racism is a problem. I live in Houston. Get approved for an upscale apartment and then show up black and see how that makes you feel. I work in fair housing for the city of Houston and have had several clients that have called to complain about issues such as this. So with that in mind, as far as working in Houston, another question is, what might mapping prejudice look like in another city's context, and what are your thoughts on the replicability of a model like this elsewhere?
Yeah, so that kind of last bit there, that's what I'm actually spending a lot of my time on right now. I do know, and kind of here's me with my geographer hat on, that kind of in academia, the way that racial covenants have been traditionally understood and the way that they've played out in Minneapolis, there's a pretty big gap there. And some of the questions that I have now are, is Minneapolis like an atypical city? Did it just kind of happen differently here, or it happened kind of comparably everywhere else? Or are some of our kind of broader understandings of like the work that racial covenants did off? And I think the only way to really answer that is to do some comparative analysis. So the kind of workflow that I've set up for this leans very heavily on open source software and solutions. So for OCR, we use the Google Tesseract engine, that's free. Zooniverse is an open platform. There's no cost to like host data there to build a project or anything. And the GIS stuff that we're doing, I personally am doing a lot of it in ARC, but you could easily do that in something like QGIS. And now that we kind of mostly have Hennepin County done, I'm working on a couple different methods articles, and also building out kind of a toolkit that sort of charts out like here's the steps that you have to follow in order to replicate this work in a different spatial context. And I think that's important because it'll help us better understand exactly how racial covenants kind of produced racial disparities that are still felt today. I think kind of the more precise we can do that, the better, in terms of constructing empirically derived policy. But also, if you follow kind of the Zooniverse model, this workflow does like meaningful labor in kind of not only building awareness, but really challenging audiences, and specifically white audiences, to kind of situate themselves in these racist geographies. And I think if you can do that, that can kind of go really far in terms of like building political will to tackle some of the more contemporary manifestations of racism and inequality that we're dealing with today.
Absolutely, and I mean, it definitely seems like, based off of your presentation, just the impact that your work seems to be having across Minneapolis, that, in trying to push forward equitable policies across the nation at the local level, this would be something that, a lot of cities might be interested in looking into.
Yeah.
So we have a few questions that all seem to be kind of revolving around a similar theme, and so, I'll just sum it up in this one person's that says, they're asking, what are your thoughts on reparations, and how does it fit into this whole narrative?
Yeah, so we're making a case for reparations. I didn't use that word in this particular presentation, but that's how certainly myself, Chris and Delegard, and the other project members think about this. That's essentially what we're doing, and we're not so much saying like, here's how you do it, or here are the specific, ways you move money around or do whatever to enact that. But I think we are building this broader case that, when you look at the longitudinal impact that these policies, which were structural and state-sponsored, and that traversed everything from, an individual property lot all the way up to the, Federal Housing Administration, right? Like, by exposing all of that, like, how can restorative justice or reparations, whatever term you want to use, like, not be the logical endpoint? right? Like, how can you look at all of this and just be like, oh, well, we'll stop doing it, I guess, and things will be better now? Um, so yeah, that's I think, you know, we're situating ourselves in that broader conversation, and again, not so much on the, you know, here's what you have to do side of it, but more that like something has to be done side. And we've found that you know, our work seems to resonate. Our work seems to convince white people that structural racism exists in a very, very effective way. And I think that's kind of our biggest contribution that we can make to this broader conversation, this broader political term, this broader political movement.
Absolutely. And with that in mind, and you know, someone else had posed this question, but how has the work been received, especially when there is kind of a politicization of the work, you know, in the context of something like reparations? I mean,
Yep.
has it been well received? Has there been pushback? What's that experience been like?
Yeah, I mean, it runs the gamut. Overall, it's been well received. I would say that, you know, when we present to audiences of color, the reaction's a little bit different. Kind of the specificity of our work might be new, but us telling a black audience that like housing discrimination exists, it's kind of like, yeah, we know. Like, what are you going to do about it? Right? Like that, you don't really need to build any political will in that section. Like they're, you know, already trying to grapple with solutions. It's the white audiences that are like shocked by this. It's the white audiences who are kind of saying like, oh my God, I had no idea or whatever, which how much they actually didn't have any idea. I don't know. I don't want to get it. I don't want to psychoanalyze our audience members. But for white audiences, the vast majority of folks react with initial kind of shock, and then are usually followed, I would say, with kind of a galvanization of wanting to do something. There has been a smaller subset of people who try to push back against us. I had one guy, actually, as I was giving a talk, he started yelling at me and said that, well, he'd looked at thousands of property deeds in Hennepin County, and he only found restrictions prohibiting the Irish from owning property. I was like, well, that's cute. I've looked at like literally 10 million. I haven't found a single one that targets the Irish. So it was kind of like this weird, like cognitive dissonance disconnect thing. But in general, I think our work has been pretty well received. We get a lot more responses that are like, wow, you know, this was kind of eye-opening. Like, what are the next steps? Like, what can we do about this? We get a lot more of that than we get, you know, kind of the, oh, you're just race baiting or, you know, picking at scabs or whatever kind of reaction. Like some of that happens, but that's definitely been the exception, not the rule.
Absolutely.
And I think
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think some of it, like this is part of why mapping covenants is so powerful, though, because if anybody disagrees with it, I mean, it's like, go to our website. You can look at these deeds yourself. You know, I mean, this isn't really like a subjective, experiential claim that we're making. You know, like we just literally have tens and tens of thousands of documents that say things like property can only be sold to a white person, right? I mean, there is sort of like a indisputability about kind of like building a research project on a corpus of material like that. And I think that's like helped kind of push through some of that initial resistance. Like it's hard to argue with 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 warranty deeds, you know?
Absolutely.
Well, I have a couple questions. One is, can Nathan put on your web information on the screen so people can see that? And the second is, how does this overlay with the work that Tom Segru has done on white flight and the pattern of disinvestment and whites moving out of neighborhoods as African Americans moved in post '68?
Yeah, and we've actually met with Tom a few times, and covenants in many ways made that kind of dispersal possible. And this was one of the things that kind of surprised me with our work, where that covenants weren't so much going into like existing established neighborhoods, they are going into the suburbs. I mean, we found many more racial covenants in the suburbs of Minneapolis versus Minneapolis proper. The reason being, the suburbs were the areas where in the 19 teens, 20s, 30s, and 40s, there were large amounts of undeveloped land. You know, a developer can buy a big chunk, turn that into 1,000 lots, throw racial covenants on all of it, and these subdivisions, and some of those ads I showed earlier kind of attest to, were intentionally promoted as kind of these like white spatial enclaves. So as white flight begins, and you know, certainly by '68 it's in full effect, but and some of Tom's work on Detroit suggested, you know, this began kind of like really post-war, so like 40s and 50s as well. That was enabled through racial covenants, because black people, there couldn't be black flight because racial covenants prevented it, right? Like you had to stay in place because you couldn't move anywhere else because of the existence of these restrictive deeds.
All right, we have another question. Somebody has asked, from a pure legal perspective, do federal laws adequately dismiss the racist requirements that may still exist in covenants or deed restrictions?
I would say yes. It is a little hodgepodgey. So Shelley v. Kramer rendered them legally unenforceable in that you couldn't sue someone for breach of contract. What people started doing, though, in the 1950s, they would sue for damages instead, making the argument that because this person sold their home to someone who isn't white, my property values are now lower because I live on the same block. So there was another Supreme Court ruling that said, well, you can't do that anymore either. Then there were some state laws, and then finally the Fair Housing Act, which just prohibited any of this language. But I mean, I do think it's a question, right? Like, what if the Fair Housing Act gets repealed? You know, I mean, I would say that was unthinkable a few years ago, but a lot's changed recently. A lot of things I thought were kind of unthinkable have some sort of become standard. So yeah, I would like to believe that we have adequate legal protections to ensure this never happens again. But I mean, if you repeal the Fair Housing Act, at that point you're really leaning on some of these on some of these Supreme Court rulings, which aren't nearly as comprehensive.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that we are running up at the end of our time, but Kevin, thank you so much for presenting and discussing with us today. It was really insightful, and there are a lot of comments in the question box that were just thanking you for the work and saying that they really enjoyed the presentation. So again, on behalf of us and everyone tuning in, thank you. To everybody else who did spend the hour with us learning today, we appreciate you being here. As everyone knows, Restoring Neighborhoods Task Force aims to lift up local research, policy changes, and best practices that help us explore the connection between housing and other community development issues. And at NHC, we want to hear from our membership about what's happening in your neck of the woods. So if you have an example of good research, of policy change, of developments, or other that you'd like to share with us, please feel free to contact us. You can contact me at npark@nhc.org. Up on the screen, we have Kevin's information if you want to get in contact with him. And again, the recording of this presentation will be sent out along with the slide deck, in the coming days. So once again, thanks so much, Kevin, for joining us, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Hopefully you can all join us next month at our next Restoring Neighborhoods webinar. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.